The network shared on social media that Joni Lamb passed away this morning. It says she experienced serious health problems that were only made worse by recent back injuries.
The decision that changed everything just weeks before her death, Joni Lamb made a decision that nobody expected. There was no announcement, no explanation, no public statement. Instead, hidden inside routine legal paperwork, she quietly signed documents that changed ownership of a multi-million-dollar property and in the process, removed her own husband from the title. The timing could not have been more unsettling. Joni was seriously ill. Her health was rapidly declining. Very few people knew how severe her condition truly was. And yet, in the middle of those final weeks, she took deliberate action to place one of her most valuable assets under her sole control. Why? What was happening behind the scenes? And what made this decision important enough to become one of the final legal acts of her life? Because the deeper you look, the more complicated the story becomes. This isn't simply about real estate. It isn't merely about inheritance. And it may not even be about money. Instead, it leads into a web of family conflict, ministry tensions, unanswered questions, and relationships that had already begun to fracture long before the paperwork was ever signed. In the final weeks of her life, Joni Lamb quietly executed a quitclaim deed involving a beachfront condominium in Florida worth nearly $3 million. The property had been purchased only months earlier. At the time of the purchase, ownership was shared between Joni and her husband, Doug Weiss. But that suddenly changed. Without public attention, the ownership structure was altered. Doug's name disappeared. The property was transferred entirely into Joni's personal revocable trust. Legally, the move was straightforward. Emotionally, it was anything but. A quitclaim deed is often used to transfer ownership interests quickly. Unlike other property documents, it does not guarantee ownership rights or provide protections. It simply transfers whatever interest one party holds. In this case, the result was clear. Joni became the sole authority over the property. Doug Weiss no longer appeared as a co-owner. And the timing is what continues to raise questions. This was not done years earlier. It was not completed immediately after the purchase. It happened only weeks before Joni died. At the same time, her health had become increasingly fragile. Publicly, very little had been disclosed. Many viewers believed she was dealing with back problems or physical injuries. Some heard references to spinal issues. Others understood only that her health had declined. But privately, the situation was much more serious. Joni was battling metastatic bone cancer. The diagnosis remained largely hidden from the public. Even as concerns grew, much of the true extent of her illness remained unknown until after her passing. Doug Weiss later spoke about fractures in her spine. Those statements explained some of her physical suffering, but they did not fully reveal what she was facing. As her health worsened, this property transfer quietly moved through public records with almost no attention. No explanation accompanied it. No statements were issued. No interviews addressed it. Yet the legal implications were significant. By moving the condominium into her own trust, Joni changed how the property would be handled after her death. Joint ownership can often simplify inheritance. But this decision moved in the opposite direction. It separated the asset. It isolated ownership. And it created a legal boundary that previously did not exist. Was this simply estate planning? Perhaps revocable trusts are commonly used to avoid probate and simplify the transfer of assets. Many individuals use them for exactly that purpose. But the circumstances surrounding this decision make it difficult to ignore the larger picture. At the time, family tensions had already emerged. Disagreements existed within both the family and the ministry. Relationships had become strained. Questions about leadership, succession, and loyalty had begun to surface, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Joni made this final legal adjustment. What was she protecting? Who was she protecting? Or perhaps the better question is this: what did she see coming? Joni was not inexperienced. She had spent decades helping build one of the most influential Christian television ministries in America. She had navigated scandals, she had faced public criticism, she had managed complex financial and organizational responsibilities. She understood business. She understood ministry. And she understood consequences. People who knew her often described her as thoughtful and deliberate. That makes the timing of this decision even more difficult to dismiss as routine paperwork. Because if anyone understood the importance of legal decisions, it was Joni Lamb. And if anyone understood the long-term consequences of estate planning, it was her. The transfer itself was quiet, but the questions it left behind have only grown louder. Because the story doesn't end with a deed. It leads directly to another figure whose role in Joni's life would become increasingly controversial. A man who entered the Daystar world as a trusted counselor. A man who built his reputation on healing marriages. A man whose own professional history would later come under scrutiny. And the deeper his story becomes, the more difficult it is to separate the personal from the public. Because understanding why Joni made this decision may require understanding Doug Weiss himself. Who is Doug Weiss? To understand why Joni Lamb made one of the final legal decisions of her life, it becomes necessary to understand the man whose name disappeared from that Florida property. For years, Doug Weiss built a reputation around helping other people save their marriages. He was known throughout Christian counseling circles as an expert on relationships, emotional healing, and intimacy. His books, conferences, counseling programs, and television appearances positioned him as someone people could trust during the most difficult moments of their lives. To many viewers, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be: a counselor, a teacher, a healer. And eventually, after years of appearing on Daystar television, he became much more than a guest. He became Joni Lamb's husband. But behind the public image was a much more complicated story. Doug Weiss established himself in Colorado Springs, where he founded Heart to Heart Counseling Center. The ministry and counseling organization offered programs designed for couples struggling with addiction, infidelity, and emotional distance within marriage. One of the ideas that became closely associated with his work was a term he frequently used: intimacy anorexia. According to Weiss, this condition described emotional and physical withdrawal inside a marriage, creating distance between spouses and damaging relationships. His books and seminars gained popularity among Christian audiences looking for guidance and restoration. Over the years, he authored dozens of books, appeared at conferences, and developed a national following. For many people, he represented hope. For struggling marriages, he offered answers. And for Christian audiences, his faith-based approach made his message especially appealing. His appearances on Daystar only strengthened that reputation. He sat alongside Joni and Marcus Lamb, he discussed marriage, he offered advice, he spoke about healing relationships. To viewers watching at home, Doug Weiss appeared to be a trusted voice inside one of Christian television's largest ministries. But outside the television cameras, questions about his professional record had already begun to emerge. Although Weiss held professional licenses in Colorado, his credentials became the subject of official scrutiny. Public records show that he received formal admonitions from the Colorado Licensing Board. One matter involved allegations that he had represented himself as a licensed marriage and family therapist despite not holding that specific license. Another complaint focused on a counseling intensive that allegedly left a couple feeling harmed rather than helped. According to the board's findings, the interventions were criticized as potentially damaging. The situation became part of his public record. For some, these incidents raised concerns. Others viewed them as professional disputes that occur within many careers. But regardless of interpretation, they added another layer to a man whose public image centered around trust and guidance. Yet none of these issues prevented his growing relationship with Daystar. In fact, his presence inside the ministry continued to expand. Viewers saw him regularly. He became a familiar face. And somewhere along the way, his connection to Joni Lamb began to change. The timeline surrounding those events would later become one of the most discussed aspects of this story. In late 2021, Marcus Lamb passed away. His death sent shockwaves through the Christian broadcasting world. He had co-founded Daystar. He had built the ministry alongside Joni. And suddenly, after decades of leadership, he was gone. For Joni, the loss was deeply personal. She had lost her husband, her ministry partner, the man with whom she had built an international network. But while the Daystar audience mourned Marcus's passing, another story was quietly unfolding. Less than 2 months after Marcus died, Doug Weiss filed for divorce from his wife of more than 30 years. The timing immediately draws attention. Court records confirm that the divorce filing occurred in January 2022. However, the divorce itself was not publicly announced until much later. During that period, Weiss continued operating his counseling practice. He continued his public ministry work. And eventually, his relationship with Joni began to emerge. According to public accounts, their courtship began during 2022. Those close to them described the relationship as careful and intentional. The couple reportedly traveled together. Their relationship progressed quickly, and by March 2023, Doug Weiss proposed. Only a few months later, in June 2023, they were married. For some observers, the speed of these events raised questions. Marcus Lamb had passed away less than 2 years earlier. Doug had recently ended a marriage that had lasted more than 3 decades. And now, both individuals were beginning a completely new chapter. Supporters viewed the marriage as healing. Critics viewed it differently. Because while the public was seeing a love story, tensions behind the scenes were already beginning to grow. Not everyone welcomed the marriage. Not everyone approved. And not everyone believed the relationship was a positive development. Some of the strongest resistance came from within Joni's own family. Her children reportedly expressed concerns. Questions emerged about timing. Questions emerged about character. Questions emerged about leadership and influence. And those concerns would eventually create divisions that extended far beyond personal relationships. Because Doug Weiss was no longer simply a counselor appearing on television. He had now entered the Lamb family itself. He had become connected not only to Joni personally, but to Daystar's future. And that changed everything. The stakes suddenly became much larger. Family relationships became intertwined with ministry leadership. Personal disagreements became organizational tensions. And questions about trust, loyalty, and succession began to grow. For supporters, Doug represented companionship during one of the most difficult periods of Joni's life. For critics, his arrival raised concerns that had never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, his own professional history continued to attract attention. Former clients had publicly criticized certain counseling methods. Questions about credentials remained part of the public record, and his previous disciplinary actions continued to be discussed. None of these matters prevented the marriage, but they contributed to the atmosphere surrounding it, an atmosphere that would only become more complicated as time passed. Because as Doug entered Joni's life, other relationships inside the family were beginning to deteriorate. Disagreements became harder to ignore. Divisions became more public. And before long, the family that had built one of the largest Christian television ministries in America found itself struggling with conflicts that reached far beyond the cameras. Looking back now, Doug Weiss stands at the center of several intersecting stories. He was the counselor, the television guest, the newly divorced husband, the new spouse, the ministry figure, and eventually, the man whose name would quietly disappear from a multimillion-dollar property only weeks before Joni's death. Whether those events are connected remains a matter of interpretation. But the timing is impossible to ignore. And as the timeline continues to unfold, the questions only become more difficult. Because the next chapter reveals how quickly events began to move after Marcus Lamb's death. And once the dates are placed side by side, the entire story takes on a very different meaning. Timeline of events after Marcus Lamb's death. Sometimes the truth of a story isn't found in what people say. It's found in dates. Because when the events surrounding Joni Lamb, Doug Weiss, and Daystar are placed side by side, the timeline itself begins to tell a story. And once those dates are examined closely, many of the questions surrounding Joni's final decisions become even more difficult to ignore. The first major event came on November 30th, 2021. That was the day Marcus Lamb died. For millions of Daystar viewers, the news came as a shock. Marcus had spent decades building one of the world's largest Christian television networks alongside his wife, Joni. Together they had become the public faces of the ministry. Their lives, their faith, and their leadership had been closely connected for years. His passing left an enormous void. Public reports stated that Marcus had been hospitalized after contracting COVID-19 and later died from heart complications. His death immediately created uncertainty surrounding the future of Daystar. But it also marked the beginning of a series of events that would eventually reshape both the family and the ministry. For Joni, the loss was deeply personal. She had lost her husband, her ministry partner, the father of her children, the man who had helped build Daystar from the ground up. As viewers mourned Marcus's death, few could have imagined how quickly circumstances would begin to change. Because less than 2 months later, another significant event occurred. On January 27, 2022, Doug Weiss filed for divorce from his wife of more than 30 years. The timing would later attract considerable attention. Public court records confirmed the filing date. Although the divorce itself became final later, the legal process had officially begun. At that point, very few people connected these events. Marcus had passed away. Doug was ending a decades-long marriage. And the future paths of both Doug and Joni remained unknown to the public. But over the following months, those paths would begin moving closer together. One detail that later generated discussion was the fact that Doug's divorce was not publicly announced immediately. For many months, the situation remained largely private. During this period, Doug continued operating his counseling practice. He continued appearing publicly. He maintained the professional image that many people had come to recognize. Meanwhile, Joni continued leading Daystar while navigating the enormous responsibilities that followed Marcus's death. She was grieving. She was leading. And she was attempting to guide the ministry through a difficult transition. Then, during 2022, something began to change. According to public accounts, Joni and Doug began a courtship. Those close to the couple later described the relationship as careful and intentional. They reportedly spent time together. They traveled. And the relationship developed steadily. For supporters, this represented healing. For critics, it raised questions. The passage of time can often feel different to those involved than it does to outside observers. For some people, enough time had passed. For others, the timeline felt surprisingly quick. As the months continued, the relationship became increasingly serious. By March of 2023, Doug Weiss proposed. Only a few months later, on June 10, 2023, Joni and Doug were married. The marriage officially brought Doug into the Lamb family. But it also brought him closer to the leadership circle of Daystar, and that changed the entire dynamic. Because Doug was no longer simply a television guest. He was no longer merely a counselor appearing on programs. He was now connected to Joni personally, financially, and publicly. And not everyone welcomed that change. As the marriage moved forward, opposition reportedly began to emerge within the family. Questions surfaced, concerns developed, disagreements became more visible. What had once been private tensions slowly began affecting relationships inside both the family and the ministry. But while these developments unfolded publicly, another story was taking place behind the scenes. Joni's health was deteriorating. Although viewers occasionally heard references to back pain and spinal problems, the full reality remained largely unknown. The public did not fully understand the seriousness of her condition. The extent of her illness remained private. In April 2026, Doug Weiss publicly mentioned that Joni had suffered fractures in her spine. Those statements helped explain some of her physical struggles, but they still did not reveal the larger picture. Behind the scenes, Joni was battling metastatic bone cancer. The diagnosis remained largely undisclosed. For many viewers, the full extent of her illness would only become clear after her death. At the same time, tensions inside the family continued to grow. Relationships became strained. Disagreements deepened. Questions regarding leadership, succession, and ministry decisions began creating divisions that would later become public. Jonathan Lamb and Suzy Lamb reportedly opposed the marriage. Their concerns involved both personal and biblical objections. these disagreements did not simply remain inside the family. They eventually affected the ministry itself. Meanwhile, Daystar was entering a period of increasing internal tension. Questions surrounding leadership continued to surface. Marcus had been gone. The future remained uncertain. And various relationships inside the organization were becoming increasingly complicated. Then came another significant development. In November 2024, Joni Lamb was dismissed from Daystar after an extended internal review process. The decision intensified the existing divisions. Joni later claimed that his dismissal was connected to disagreements involving ministry issues and family conflicts. Joni disputed those claims, stating that the decision involved performance and insubordination concerns. The differing accounts only added to the growing uncertainty. By this point, the divisions inside the family had become impossible to ignore. The disagreements had expanded beyond personal relationships. Leadership, governance, inheritance, loyalty, each issue appeared increasingly connected. And all of it was unfolding while Joni's health continued to decline. Then, in the final weeks of her life, another event entered the timeline. The Florida condominium. The property that Joni and Doug had jointly owned. The property purchased after their marriage. The property worth nearly $3 million. Quietly, and without public explanation, Joni signed the paperwork. Doug's name was removed. Ownership transferred into her personal trust. Only weeks later, Joni passed away. When viewed individually, each event may appear separate. A death, a divorce, a relationship, a marriage, family disagreements, leadership disputes, a property transfer, an illness. But when these events are placed side by side, the timeline begins to feel very different. Because the questions become unavoidable. Why did Joni make this legal change when she did? What concerns existed behind the scenes? What conversations took place privately? And what factors influenced one of the final decisions of her life? The timeline itself offers no direct answers. Dates rarely do. But they provide context, and sometimes context reveals more than explanations ever could. Because as the months passed, the disagreements inside the Lamb family were no longer isolated tensions. They had become something much larger. Family relationships were breaking down, trust was fading, sides were being chosen, and the ministry itself was becoming increasingly divided. The next chapter moves beyond the dates and into the emotional center of this story. Because behind the legal documents and public statements was a family struggling with loyalty, conflict, and unresolved pain. And those tensions would eventually leave lasting scars on everyone involved. Family and ministry tensions. As Joni Lamb's relationship with Doug Weiss became more serious, tensions inside the family began to grow. What appeared to be a new chapter for Joni was viewed very differently by some of her children. Joni and Suzy Lamb reportedly opposed the relationship, citing both personal and biblical concerns. Their objections created divisions that extended beyond private family disagreements and eventually affected the ministry itself. Because Daystar was more than a family business. It was a ministry, a television network, and an organization built around family leadership. As a result, personal conflicts often became ministry conflicts. The disagreements surrounding Doug Weiss reportedly involved multiple family members and close associates. Some initially opposed the marriage, while others later apologized and attempted to repair relationships. These shifting positions reflected how emotionally difficult the situation had become. The tension deepened as questions about leadership and succession began to surface. Many believed Joni Lamb would eventually take on a larger leadership role after Marcus Lamb's death. However, those expectations became increasingly uncertain as family disagreements continued. In November 2024, Joni was dismissed from Daystar after an internal review. Joni later stated that his removal was connected to ministry concerns and family disagreements. Joni disagreed, stating that the decision involved performance issues and insubordination. The differing explanations only increased public speculation. At the center of these conflicts stood Joni herself. She was not only a mother and wife, but also the leader of one of the world's largest Christian television networks. Every family decision carried ministry consequences. Every leadership decision affected personal relationships. And all of this was happening while her health was declining. Reports later suggested that some relationships remained strained until the end of Joni's life. The lack of reconciliation left emotional wounds that continue to shape how many people view these events. The disagreements were never simply about a marriage. They involved trust, leadership, family loyalty, and the future of Daystar itself. As these tensions continued to grow, another issue began attracting attention: money, property, and the future of Joni's estate. Because behind the family conflicts stood millions of dollars in assets, ministry resources, and questions that would only become more important during Joni's final months. Financial A&D estate complexities. As family tensions continued to grow, another issue quietly moved to the center of the story. Money, not simply income or property, but millions of dollars in assets, real estate, and ministry resources that added another layer to an already complicated situation. Joni Lamb was not only the leader of a major Christian television network, she was also responsible for a significant estate that included properties in multiple states. Public records showed that Joni owned several properties in Texas, Florida, and Georgia. Altogether, her real estate holdings represented millions of dollars in value. Among those properties was the Florida condominium that would later become the center of attention. Valued at nearly $3 million, the condominium was jointly owned by Joni and Doug Weiss before it was transferred into Joni's personal trust. But this property was only one part of a much larger financial picture. Reports estimated Joni's overall estate to be worth tens of millions of dollars. Along with real estate, her assets included personal wealth, compensation, and interests connected to the ministry she helped lead for decades. Joni also served as one of Daystar's primary leaders. Internal records showed that her compensation had increased significantly in recent years, reflecting her role within the organization. Supporters viewed this as appropriate compensation for leading a global television ministry. Critics questioned whether greater transparency was needed. Another issue that drew attention involved Daystar's private aircraft. Reports documented numerous flights between Texas, Colorado Springs, and Florida. Because Colorado was Doug Weiss's home and Florida later became the location of the condominium purchase, these travel records generated additional questions. Some viewed the travel as normal ministry operations. Others questioned the costs involved. Expense reports involving luxury resorts and travel expenditures also became part of the public discussion. Daystar maintained that personal expenses had been reimbursed, and Joni denied any misuse of ministry resources. However, these financial discussions added further tension during an already difficult period. Jonathan Lamb reportedly raised concerns regarding certain expenses during internal meetings, contributing to disagreements over financial oversight and accountability. At the same time, Doug Weiss's counseling organization faced criticism from some former clients regarding counseling methods and expensive treatment programs. Although these matters were separate from Daystar, they added another layer to the public conversation surrounding his role. Together, these financial issues created a complicated backdrop. Joni was managing a large estate. She was leading a ministry. She was navigating family conflicts. And she was privately battling a serious illness. This is what makes the Florida property transfer so significant. The condominium was not her only asset. It was one property among many. Yet it became one of the final legal decisions of her life. Was she simplifying her estate? Protecting assets? Trying to avoid future disputes? The available records cannot answer those questions. But they do show that the decision was likely deliberate. Joni had spent decades managing ministry affairs, handling controversies, and making important decisions. Nothing in her history suggests that such a move would have been made without careful thought. As financial concerns became intertwined with family tensions, the story grew increasingly difficult to separate. Family disagreements affected leadership. Leadership affected finances, and finances affected questions about inheritance and legacy. By the time Joni transferred the Florida condominium into her trust, the pressures surrounding her family, ministry, health, and estate had all converged. And that quiet legal decision would eventually become one of the most discussed aspects of her final months. Possible motivations and unanswered questions. In the end, the documents tell us what happened. They do not tell us why. That may be the most difficult part of Joni Lamb's story. Because after the property transfer, the family conflicts, the financial questions, and the ministry tensions, one truth remains: only Joni truly knew why she made her final decisions, and she never publicly explained them. The Florida condominium had once belonged to both Joni and Doug Weiss. Then, quietly and without explanation, Doug's name was removed and the property was transferred into Joni's personal trust. Only weeks later, she passed away. That timing continues to raise questions. One possible explanation is simple estate planning. Revocable trusts are often used to avoid probate, organize assets, and make the transfer of property easier after death. Given Joni's declining health, such planning would not have been unusual. But the circumstances surrounding the decision make it more difficult to view it as merely routine. At the time, family relationships had become strained. Disagreements remained unresolved. Leadership questions surrounded Daystar, and Joni was privately battling a serious illness. All of these factors existed during the final months of her life. Some believe the transfer may have been intended to protect certain assets. Others wonder whether Joni hoped to prevent future disputes. Some question whether family tensions influenced her decision. The truth is that no public evidence provides a clear answer. The relationship between Joni and some of her children had become increasingly difficult. Reports suggested that reconciliation never fully occurred before her passing. Because estate decisions often reflect personal relationships, these family divisions continue to shape public speculation. Doug Weiss's role also adds uncertainty. Although he was Joni's husband, his relationship with portions of the family remained complicated. His arrival into the ministry had generated criticism, and his growing influence created concern among some family members. Whether any of these issues influenced Joni's decision remains unknown. The larger financial picture cannot be ignored either. Joni's estate reportedly included millions of dollars in assets and properties across several states. The Florida condominium represented only one part of a much larger estate. Yet it became one of the final decisions she personally made. That fact gives the transfer significance. Joni had spent decades navigating challenges, controversies, and leadership responsibilities. She understood business. She understood ministry. And she understood the importance of planning. Nothing about her history suggests impulsive decision-making. The future of Daystar also remains part of the story. Leadership transitions, family tensions, and questions about succession created uncertainty inside the ministry. Whether Joni's final decisions were connected to those larger concerns may never be fully known. What remains are the facts. Marcus Lamb died. Doug Weiss entered Joni's life. Family divisions grew. Joni's health declined. The property ownership changed. And shortly afterward, Joni passed away. The events are documented. The motivations are not. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate. Because it involves family, faith, loss, legacy, and the difficult decisions people make near the end of life. The documents explain what happened. The timeline shows when it happened. But the reasons behind Joni Lamb's final decision may remain one of the unanswered chapters of her story.